There is a specific kind of quiet that settles into an old house when you live in it alone. It is a heavy, breathing silence that lingers in the corners, especially on mornings like this one. I am Eleanor Vance. Today is Mother's Day. I sat at my wooden vanity, my fingers tracing the worn edges of the gold band on my left ring finger. 36 years. That is how long Thomas and I wore those bands before a sudden heart attack took him away, leaving me with a silent house, a garage full of engine parts, and a lifetime of memories. For a 63-year-old widow, holidays do not feel like celebrations. They feel like a spotlight pointed directly at the empty chair across the table. I looked at my reflection, smoothing down the lapels of my dark wool coat. It was a simple, practical coat, sturdy, clean, and completely unremarkable. It was the exact coat I wore when I spent my days elbow deep in grease as an automotive mechanic. I spent decades fixing engines. After enough years under the hood, you stop judging a machine by its shiny paint. You learn to notice what's broken underneath. My phone buzzed on the wood surface. It was Julian, my only son. "Mom, are you ready?" His voice came through the speaker, rushed and strained. "I told Evie we'd pick you up in 20 minutes. Don't keep her waiting. You know how she gets when our schedule gets pushed back." I closed my eyes for a brief second. I worked long hours so Julian could finish college. Years later, he climbed the corporate ladder. I spent my life building a sturdy foundation beneath his feet, but lately, talking to him felt like talking to a stranger reading someone else's script. "I am ready, Julian," I said calmly. "I'll be waiting on the porch." When his black sedan pulled up to the curb, I stepped outside. Julian hopped out to open the passenger door, but his eyes darted nervously toward the rear window, where his wife was tapping impatiently on her phone screen. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom," Julian murmured quickly, pressing a cold, hurried kiss against my cheek before hastily ushering me into the back seat, right beside Genevieve. Genevieve, or Evie, as she preferred, did not look up from her screen. She was 32, working as a senior financial consultant, living her life as if human relationships were nothing more than a giant spreadsheet. Sitting beside her in my plain coat, I could feel her calculating my worth and finding it entirely negative. "Good morning, Genevieve," I said, keeping my voice even. She gave a vague hum, her thumbs flying across her glass screen. "Traffic was a nightmare on Massachusetts Avenue, Julian," she said, ignoring me completely. "If we miss our reservation window at the Gilded Hearth, the host is going to give our table away. You know how critical my afternoon conference call with London is." Julian shrank into his seat, his shoulders hunching. "I'm sorry, honey. I told you we should have taken the bypass. We'll be there on time, I promise." I sat quietly in the back, looking out the window as downtown Boston blurred past. My son, a grown man managing millions in corporate assets, was sweating bullets just because his wife was mildly inconvenienced by traffic. I watched the way he constantly glanced into the rearview mirror to seek her validation. It was the posture of a man who traded his backbone for a quiet life. 10 minutes later, the car pulled up in front of the Gilded Hearth, a grand modern Gothic revival restaurant nestled between historic brick structures, featuring towering stained glass windows, heavy wrought iron fixtures, and a reputation for an ultra-exclusive tasting menu. The valet rushed forward to open Genevieve's door, while Julian hurried around to let me out. As we walked up the stone steps toward the heavy double doors, Genevieve paused. She turned around, looked me up and down with a slow, thorough sweep of her eyes, and let out a dry, condescending chuckle. "Are you seriously wearing that coat, Eleanor?" she asked, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive pity. "I mean, I know you like to keep things historical, but this is the Gilded Hearth. People here actually dress for the room. You look like you're heading down to a municipal garage to fix a transmission." Julian flinched. He looked at me, his eyes wide with panic. But instead of defending his mother against open humiliation, he lowered his gaze to the pavement, clearing his throat nervously. "Ah, Mom, maybe Evie's right," Julian muttered, dropping his voice to a whisper. "The crowd in here is high-end. We could have stopped by your apartment first so you could change into something modern." I stopped walking. I looked at my son, the boy I raised through sleepless nights and physical labor, and saw a coward more afraid of his wife's sharp tongue than of breaking his mother's heart. I looked at Genevieve, then down at Julian, and a cold stillness washed over me. The trap was set. The stage was ready, and they had no idea what kind of machine they were about to mess with. Looking back now, that was the last ordinary Mother's Day my son and I would ever share. The host seated us at a corner table beneath a magnificent stained glass window. The ambient lighting cast amber reflections across the white tablecloth, but the atmosphere at our table immediately chilled the air. Before the menus were even opened, Genevieve set the tone. A young waiter, no older than 21, with a badge reading Leo pinned to his vest, hurried over with a chilled pitcher of water. His hands shook slightly. "Good evening. Welcome to the Gilded Hearth," Leo said, his voice cracking. "May I start you all with some sparkling water?" Genevieve did not look up from her phone. She waved a dismissive hand. "Skip it and listen carefully," Genevieve interrupted, her tone icy. "I want the artisanal pork chop done strictly medium well, not a single shade of pink. Replace the standard herb reduction with a plain extra virgin olive oil, unheated, cold-pressed, and served in a separate ramekin. If the kitchen ruins the sear, like last month, I'm sending it straight back. Do you understand me?" Leo swallowed hard, his face flushing red. "Yes, ma'am. I'll make sure the kitchen follows it precisely." "And make sure the plates are pre-warmed," Genevieve snapped, shutting her phone with a click. "It astounds me how a restaurant charging these prices can serve cold food. The management here must be asleep at the wheel." Julian offered a weak, apologetic smile to the young waiter. "Just get what she asked for, son." "Thank you," Julian muttered, staring down at his menu. Leo nodded quickly and bolted toward the service station. I picked up my glass of ice water, took a slow sip, and let my gaze drift across the room. In that quiet moment, my mind drifted back 36 years to Thomas, my late husband. He wasn't a man of wealth, but a master carpenter with hands stained by wood dust. I remember when Julian was a toddler, we stopped at a diner. A young busboy accidentally spilled water onto Thomas's work jacket. The boy was terrified he would lose his job. Thomas simply smiled, handed the boy his clean handkerchief, and said, "Son, wood dries and water evaporates, but a frightened boy stays broken for a long time. Take a breath. You're doing fine." I looked across the table at Julian. The boy Thomas and I raised had vanished. Sitting in his place was a grown man who watched his wife humiliate a kid working through college, yet chose to say nothing, choosing to smile through the insult just to keep his household quiet. Genevieve continued her monologue, complaining about her firm's junior analysts, before finally turning her sharp, judgmental eyes toward me. "Honestly, Eleanor, I don't know how you manage living in that old house by yourself," Genevieve said, leaning forward with a patronizing smirk. "Without a routine, people stagnate. You must feel so disconnected." Julian didn't look up, pretending to inspect the wine list. That was the exact second the tolerance limit was reached. I set my glass of water down on the wood table. The tiny droplets of condensation made a rhythmic tap against the coaster. I did not raise my voice, nor did I slam my hand down. I simply straightened my back, raised my chin, and looked straight into Genevieve's cold eyes with the calm of a mechanic who has just diagnosed a fatal flaw. "You don't need to worry about who is paying for this meal, Genevieve," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise with crystal clarity. "What you should be worrying about is whether you even have enough basic human decency to sit at the table with the people who are paying for it." The English translation hung heavily in the air between us. "You don't need to worry about who is paying for this meal, Genevieve. What you should be worrying about is whether you even have enough basic human decency to sit at the table with the people who are paying for it." Nobody moved. Even the waiter forgot he was holding the water pitcher. Before anyone opened their mouth, I already knew something between us had broken for good. For 3 seconds, the entire corner of the dining room went dead silent. Genevieve's mouth stayed half open, her jaw locking up. The smug smirk vanished, replaced by an ugly flush of crimson creeping up from her collar to her blonde hair. Her eyes widened in absolute shock, as if she had just been struck by an elderly woman she had spent the evening dismissing as a harmless nobody. Julian dropped his wine list. The heavy leather menu hit the floor with a dull thud. He stared at me, pale and paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The silence at our corner table stretched out for nearly a minute, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the faint clinking of silverware from neighboring tables. Genevieve recovered from her initial shock quickly, her expression snapping back into that cold, calculating mask of absolute superiority. She adjusted her diamond bracelet, cleared her throat, and turned away from me as if I had ceased to exist. The rest of our 2-hour tasting menu passed in a blur of chilling frost. No one spoke. Genevieve pecked at her pork chop with exaggerated precision, while Julian stared down into his wine glass like a man trapped at the bottom of a well, too cowardly to look me in the eye. Finally, the meal came to its inevitable conclusion. Marcus, our young waiter, Leo's supervisor, approached our table with a polished stride. In his hand, he carried a heavy, dark leather folder containing the final check, the total cost of our Mother's Day celebration. He placed it neatly in the center of the white tablecloth, right between Julian's water goblet and Genevieve's dessert fork. Before Julian could even reach his hand across the table, Genevieve's hand shot out with blinding speed. She snatched the leather folder, flipped it open with a sharp crack, and scanned the digital printout. $1,200. $1,200 for a 3-person tasting menu, complete with vintage pairings and service fees. The moment she saw the number, a wicked, vindictive smile curled across her lips. This was her moment to punish me, to put me firmly back in what she believed was my proper, impoverished place. Genevieve slammed the folder shut, slid it firmly away from Julian, and raised her voice just enough to carry across the adjacent booths, ensuring every diner within a 20-foot radius could hear her clearly. "We are not paying for her," Genevieve announced, her tone sharp, loud, and dripping with public humiliation. She gestured dismissively toward me with her manicured fingernail. "The salmon, the vintage wine, the side dishes, all of that belongs to Eleanor. Let her pay for her own meal. We are only covering our own portion of the bill. Split the check right now, please." The ambient murmur of the restaurant dropped an octave. Heads turned at nearby tables. Conversations paused entirely. I looked at my son. This was the defining second of his life, the exact crossroad where a true man stands up and defends the mother who carried him through the darkest years of her widowhood. Julian sat completely paralyzed. His face turned an ash gray, drained of every drop of blood. His lips pressed together into a thin, white line of sheer terror. He looked at me, then looked at his wife, and instead of finding his voice, Instead of demanding basic respect for his mother, Julian did the most despicable thing a son could possibly do. He slowly lowered his chin. He gave a microscopic, cowardly nod of agreement. He chose his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity. He chose silence over honor. In that single, sickening second, the son I had raised, the boy I had poured my entire soul into protecting after his father died, completely vanished into a puddle of spineless submission. My heart did not break. It hardened into cold, tempered steel. As a widow who had spent decades burying a beloved husband, fighting off financial ruin, and working through industrial machinery breakdowns that would have crushed a weaker spirit, I had learned one absolute truth. You never waste tears on a coward. Silence at that moment was not weakness. It was the absolute calm before the heavy iron hammer of karma fell upon them. I did not raise my voice, nor did I rush my movements. With deliberate, absolute composure, I let the heavy silence build for a few agonizing seconds, letting the full weight of their public cruelty settle over the table. Then slowly, I reached into the simple canvas pocket of my dark wool coat and pulled out a plain, unembellished debit card tied to my personal account. I slid the card across the mahogany table toward Marcus, who stood frozen in absolute horror at Genevieve's atrocious behavior. "Put the entire balance on this card, Marcus," I said, my voice steady, clear, and carrying an effortless authority that made the young manager look down at me with sudden, profound perplexity. Across from me, Julian caught sight of my simple card. For the first time all evening, a cold wave of existential dread washed over his face. Deep inside his chest, beneath layers of corporate ambition and marital submission, a terrifying realization began to claw its way up. He had just publicly humiliated the wrong person, and the consequences were about to hit him like a freight train. Marcus did not move for 3 full seconds. His hand remained outstretched over the table, his fingers trembling slightly as they hovered above my simple debit card. Instead of taking the card to process the bill, Marcus lowered his eyes from the plastic surface and looked directly into my face. The professional mask that high-end hospitality managers wear dissolved, replaced by an expression of profound realization. His breath caught in his throat. 4 years ago, Marcus's wife, Sarah, was diagnosed with an aggressive cancer requiring an urgent specialized surgery costing $45,000. Insurance denied the claim, and they stood on the absolute precipice of ruin. What Marcus never knew was that the miracle arrived on a Tuesday afternoon through an anonymous medical trust fund. At the time, I had just sold a small commercial property. Sitting alone in my quiet house with more capital than a widow needed, I overheard a conversation at a local butcher shop about Marcus's desperate plight. A good man losing his wife because a hospital cared more about bank wires than a human life. Without telling a single soul, not even my son, I instructed my financial advisor to wire the exact remaining balance of $45,000 directly into Sarah's hospital trust account. I attached no name and no demand for recognition. To me, it was simply an act of human decency, a way to keep another family from sitting across an empty dining table the way I did every single day. For 4 agonizing years, Marcus had searched for the mysterious benefactor, and tonight, while running the evening service logs, he had spotted a reservation name that made his heart stop. Eleanor Vance, booked for a Mother's Day dinner by her financial director's son. I never expected him to remember. I certainly never expected him to remember in front of an entire dining room. For a second, I wish Thomas could have been sitting beside me. Marcus stared down at my debit card, and then his eyes met mine. in that silent exchange between two adults who understood the true weight of suffering, all the noise of the dining room vanished. Marcus straightened up. He did not swipe the card. Instead, he carefully picked it up, placed it back into my palm, and closed my fingers gently over it with a reverence usually reserved for sacred artifacts. Then Marcus turned around, his eyes locked onto Genevieve, who was still wearing that smug, vindictive smirk, expecting the restaurant to humiliate me over the bill. "Mr. Marcus, is there a problem with her card?" Genevieve snapped, leaning forward. "If her account is declined, I told you, we are separating the checks right now. We are not covering her extravagant tastes." Marcus did not answer her immediately. He walked toward the central service station, picked up the house microphone used for floor management announcements, and pressed a button. A soft chime echoed through the sophisticated sound system, silencing the ambient chatter. Every head turned toward our table. Genevieve frowned. Julian looked up, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. Marcus walked back to our table, stood directly behind my chair, and spoke in a clear, ringing voice that carried to every corner of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests of the Gilded Hearth," Marcus began, his voice trembling slightly with emotion, yet ringing with authority. "Tonight, we are honored to host a very special guest. For the past 4 years, I have searched every avenue of this city to find the person who saved my wife's life when we had lost all hope. The person who anonymously paid a $45,000 medical debt without asking for a single word of thanks." Genevieve's smirk froze dead on her face. Her mouth parted in stunned disbelief. Marcus turned his gaze down at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He placed his right hand over his heart, bowed deeply, and finished his sentence. "Tonight, that person's card was handed to me at this very table. Therefore, on behalf of the Gilded Hearth management, our entire staff, and my family, I am deeply privileged to announce Mrs. Eleanor Vance's entire meal tonight, and every meal she ever wishes to grace this establishment with for the rest of her life, is completely free of charge." A stunned gasp rippled through the dining room. Genevieve turned sheet white, her jaw dropping so low it nearly hit the linen tablecloth. She whipped her head around to look at Julian, then back at me, her mind utterly failing to compute how an elderly woman in a plain wool coat had just been declared an honored VIP guest of the most exclusive restaurant in Boston. Before Genevieve could recover her breath or string together a single coherent syllable, Marcus turned his attention back to the service terminal in his hand. He tapped the screen just once, revealing the quiet, unyielding truth of who sat at this table. Since there seems to be a profound misunderstanding here regarding who actually owns the ground you are standing on, let me clarify the records for everyone present, Marcus announced, his voice dropping into a register of absolute, unyielding coldness. One by one, heads turned toward our table from neighboring booths. Someone whispered. A server froze in place with a tray of wine glasses. Genevieve's smug smile completely disappeared, her eyes widening in sudden, unadulterated panic. Julian finally looked up, his face draining of all color. Marcus didn't need to read a long speech. The single elite profile on the screen said it all. Eleanor Vance, founding chairperson, strategic shareholder, and permanent VIP lifetime exemption. Genevieve's face lost every remaining trace of color, turning the shade of old parchment. The spreadsheet in her brain, the one that always calculated net worth, social ranking, and depreciation value, had just experienced a catastrophic system crash. For a woman who lived her entire life worshiping corporate hierarchy, realizing she had just spent 2 hours openly humiliating a 14% strategic owner of the parent company, Holding her husband's corporate debt was a nightmare, far worse than any firing. Marcus stepped closer to our table, his posture rigid, his professional demeanor carved out of pure stone. He looked down at Genevieve and Julian with a gaze that could freeze boiling water. Mrs. Vance is not a guest who needs anyone's charity, nor is she someone whose meals are subject to division, Marcus said, every word hitting the quiet air like a falling anvil. And as for the $1,200 bill on this table, let me make one final matter crystal clear. Marcus tapped the leather folder, sliding it back toward Julian, who was currently pressed so far back into his leather chair he looked ready to melt through the upholstery. The policy of the gilded hearth is absolute, Marcus continued, his voice ringing out across the quiet dining room. Because of the severe harassment directed toward our junior staff earlier this evening, and because of the direct insults hurled at our founding shareholder, right here in this dining room, effective immediately, Genevieve and Julian Vance, you are both formally and permanently banned from this establishment and from every single property owned by our corporate group nationwide. The word hung in the air like a heavy gavel strike. Banned. A collective murmur rolled across the surrounding tables. Whispers broke out among Boston's elite as they realized the young couple in the designer clothes had just been permanently blacklisted from the most prestigious culinary landmark in the city. Genevieve let out a choked, desperate sound, her hands flying to her mouth. Her status, her social cachet, her carefully constructed illusion of upper-class immunity evaporated in a single second. I never asked Julian to defend me anymore. I only watched him. He never once looked at me. She turned her panicked, wide eyes toward Julian, expecting her husband to salvage something, to argue, to fight back. Julian didn't even lift his head. He sat there, utterly shattered, knowing that his corporate directors and executive partners dined at this very venue every single week. Being permanently barred from the gilded hearth meant he was effectively blacklisted from every social and professional circle that mattered in Boston. His career, his marriage, and his dignity had all collapsed in less than 60 seconds. As for the bill, Marcus added smoothly, picking up Julian's own corporate credit card that had been sitting on the side tray, the $1,200 balance remains entirely active, and it will be billed directly to Mr. Julian Vance's account as requested. Payment has been processed and approved. Before Julian or Genevieve could utter a single word of protest, two security officers in tailored black suits stepped out smoothly from the side hallway. They didn't make a scene. They simply stood beside our table with quiet, immovable authority, their posture leaving zero room for negotiation. "Right this way, please," Marcus said, gesturing politely toward the grand oak and iron double doors of the entrance. Genevieve choked back a sob of pure humiliation, grabbing her designer handbag with trembling fingers and practically stumbling out of her seat. She couldn't even look at the surrounding diners whose eyes were locked onto her disgrace. Julian stood up slowly, his legs shaking beneath him, and followed his wife toward the exit, a broken man carrying the heaviest check of his entire life. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the view of their hurried, miserable retreat, the tense silence in the dining room slowly dissolved back into soft conversation. Marcus turned back to me, the harsh corporate coldness vanishing from his face, replaced by a warm, deeply respectful smile. He gently pulled out my chair, helping me gather my dark wool coat. "Happy Mother's Day, Mrs. Vance," Marcus said softly, his voice full of genuine gratitude. "Thank you for coming home." I looked down at the empty chair across the table, the space where Thomas used to sit. For the first time all day, the heavy, breathing silence in my heart didn't feel cold anymore. The engine was fixed, the system was balanced. and the road ahead finally felt clear. The morning sunlight cutting through my kitchen window felt different today, sharper, cleaner, untangled from the heavy breathing silence that had lived in these corners for 5 years. I was standing at the counter pouring a cup of black coffee when my phone rang. It was Julian. His call came through at precisely 7:15 a.m. When I slid my thumb across the screen and pressed it to my ear, there were no corporate pleasantries, no rushed schedules, and no nervous glances. Instead, the only sound coming through the speaker was a ragged, unsteady breathing, followed by the unmistakable sound of a grown man sobbing into his hands. "Mom," Julian's voice cracked, thin and hollow, completely stripped of his professional composure. "Mom, please. You have to help me. I don't know what to do anymore. Evie has been screaming at me since we got back last night." I didn't say a word. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch on the line. "She packed up half her things around 3 a.m, Julian choked out, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "She kept calling me a spineless failure, screaming that because of my incompetence, we've been permanently blacklisted from the Gilded Hearth and every upscale venue in the city. She said her friends in the financial sector are already talking, that our social standing is completely ruined, and she told me she's staying at a luxury hotel downtown until I figure out how to fix it with the board." He paused, gasping for air, waiting for me to jump in, to offer a soothing maternal reassurance, to tell him that everything would be okay. Instead, I remained entirely still. I didn't rush to save him. For 20 seconds, the only sound on the line was his heavy, ragged breathing against the cold dial tone. "Mom, are you listening to me?" he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer desperation. "She said our marriage is hanging by a thread because I couldn't even manage my own family." "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through his frantic tears with absolute unyielding clarity, "listen to me very carefully." The crying on the other end of the line quieted into a stunned, trembling hush. "For 34 years, I gave you my life," I continued, keeping my tone steady and calm. "When your father died, I worked hard so you never had to feel the cold bite of poverty, building a foundation beneath your feet and teaching you right from wrong. But last night at that dinner table, you had a choice. You had a choice between defending the dignity of the mother who carried you through her deepest grief, or protecting your wife's vanity and your own comfortable silence." Julian let out a ragged breath. "Mom." I knew I was wrong the second I nodded. I kept telling myself I'd speak up. Every minute I waited made it harder. Then it was too late. "You didn't keep the peace, Julian. You traded your spine for a quiet life," I interrupted, my words falling like heavy iron hammers. "You watched a woman humiliate your mother. You let her push away a $1,200 bill because you thought it would punish me. And when the truth came to light, you didn't even have the courage to look me in the eye. You had 36 years of being my son, but last night you chose to stay silent to protect your wife's wallet instead of defending the honor of your widowed mother." The line went dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of city traffic coming through his phone speaker. I believed him, I thought quietly to myself, letting the weight of his confession settle. But that didn't mean everything could go back to the way it had been. "I forgive you, Julian," I said aloud, my voice devoid of anger, which made it infinitely heavier. "Because you carry your father's blood, and because I know what it's like to be trapped under the thumb of a ruthless environment. But let one thing be completely clear. The sheltering is over. The safety net of my indulgence has ended. My home is no longer a shelter for a coward. "Mom, please don't say that," Julian whispered, terror creeping back into his voice. "Are you cutting me off? Can I come over this weekend to talk?" "No, Julian," I replied, my tone final. "You need to stay right where you are. And for the first time in your adult life, you need to look in the mirror and face the exact machine you've built with your own choices." Before he could answer, before he could beg or cry again, I pressed the red button and ended the call. I set the phone down on the wooden counter. The screen went dark. Miles away, in a sleek downtown apartment filled with designer furniture and cold, empty rooms, my son was finally beginning to realize what real destruction looked like. Not a broken bank account, but a hollowed-out soul trapped in a marriage built on a spreadsheet, with no one left to rescue him from the wreckage of his own cowardice. If you expected Genevieve to learn a shred of humility after being publicly ejected from the gilded hearth, you clearly did not know her kind. Within 48 hours, the narrative in her social circles shifted entirely. Instead of facing the reality of her own arrogance, Genevieve took to her group chats and country club circles, painting herself as the victim of a toxic, manipulative family. She went so far as to spread whispers that the gilded hearth was plagued by corruption, claiming the management targeted wealthy patrons arbitrarily, yet her brand of pride was as fragile as cheap glass. 3 days after the incident, thinking she could sneak into an upscale sister restaurant across town for a business lunch under her maiden name, Genevieve attempted to bypass the system. The moment she stepped into the foyer, the venue's security profile flagged her instantly. The branch manager didn't make a public scene or pick up a microphone this time. He simply walked over to her table before the menus were even opened, leaned down, and spoke in a quiet, unyielding professional tone. "Pardon me, Mrs. Vance, or Miss Miller," the manager said smoothly. "Our system indicates that you are permanently restricted from all properties under our corporate umbrella. I must kindly ask you to leave the premises immediately." According to the host who watched it happen, Genevieve turned the color of raw dough, grabbed her designer bag, and fled out the side exit before her associates even realized what was happening. Her expulsion was swift, silent, and absolute. While Genevieve was busy trying to salvage her shattered status in empty hotel lobbies, my own house was experiencing a very different kind of weather. The heavy, suffocating silence that had anchored itself to my walls for 5 long years began to lift, replaced by the warm, living cadence of genuine human connection. Marcus and Sarah started coming by on Sunday afternoons. They didn't arrive with expensive gifts or hollow pleasantries. They brought simple things: a warm loaf of artisan sourdough, a ceramic pot of blooming lavender, and a quiet, abiding gratitude that filled every corner of the room. On those evenings, the 3 of us would sit around my wooden dining table. We talked about ordinary things: market prices, gardening tips, the simple mechanics of keeping an old engine running. Sarah would laugh, a bright, clear sound that completely chased away the ghost of the hospital room where she almost lost her life. Watching Marcus pull out her chair with the same steady devotion he showed on the restaurant floor, I realized that true wealth wasn't measured in corporate shares or dining room privileges. It was measured in the people who chose to show up for you when the lights went out. They filled the empty space at the end of the table, the space where Thomas used to sit, not by trying to replace him, but by honoring the warmth he had left behind. Then came a Tuesday afternoon in late May. I was out on the back porch, pruning the rose bushes, when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I didn't rush. I slowly put down my gardening shears, wiped my hands on my apron, and turned around to look. A sleek, silver sedan had parked near the side gate. The driver's side door opened, and Julian stepped out. He was alone. There was no designer handbag sitting in the passenger seat, no sharp-tongued directives being barked through a Bluetooth earpiece, and no rushed corporate schedule driving his movements. Julian stood there almost a full minute before knocking. I could tell he had rehearsed that apology 100 times. He stood by the car for a moment, looking up at the porch. His shoulders were slightly hunched, and his face carried the tired lines of a man who had spent the last week fighting a losing war in a hollow marriage. But as he walked up the wooden steps toward me, something in his posture was different. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't walking like a man playing a role written by someone else. He stopped a few feet away from me, looking down at his hands before raising his eyes to meet mine. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly, his voice steady for the first time in days. "I came alone." I looked at my son, standing on my porch without his wife, without his corporate armor, and without an excuse. The road ahead of him was going to be long and difficult, and his marriage was quietly fracturing under the weight of its own superficiality. But as the afternoon breeze rustled through the oak trees overhead, I felt a quiet, steady calm settle into my chest. "Come on inside, Julian," I said, stepping aside to hold the screen door open. "Let's talk." If you had told me a year ago that I would be sitting by this exact window, watching the snow fall over Boston with a genuine smile, I probably would have laughed. Or cried. Probably both. Today marks exactly 1 year since that Mother's Day disaster. A full 12 months since the table of cold food, ungrateful silence, and people who thought my life was just a bank account waiting to be drained became nothing more than a closed chapter. Tonight, I am back at the gilded hearth. But the atmosphere is entirely different. The air doesn't carry that suffocating tension anymore. It smells of rich wine, roasted rosemary, and genuine warmth. Marcus walked out of the kitchen himself, carrying a crystal flute of vintage champagne. He didn't hover nervously, nor did he speak in scripted, polite restaurant tones. He pulled out the chair opposite mine, sat down, and poured himself a glass. We talked about everything and nothing, recipes, the winter weather, old memories, like family. There was no performance here, no audience to impress, just mutual respect earned the hard way. Sitting here, my eyes drift to the empty space across from me. For a fleeting second, I can almost picture Thomas sitting there, flashing that quiet, steady smile of his. I miss him. I miss the warmth of his hands and the deep, anchoring comfort of his voice. But as I look across the table and see Marcus, a man whose family was saved by quiet grace, I realize the empty chair isn't lonely anymore. It is a space holding memory and new life together. I leave the restaurant before the evening rush peaks, stepping out into the crisp Boston air. The snow is falling in soft, heavy flakes, blanketing the historic brick streets in a coat of pure white. I pull my dark wool coat a little tighter around my shoulders and walk slowly toward my car. When I unlock the front door of my old house, the heavy, breathing silence that once lived in these corners is completely gone. In its place is a steady, gentle warmth. I walk into the kitchen, turn on the soft counter light, and set my keys down on the wooden surface. There are no frantic phone calls waiting, no cold hotel rooms across town, and no toxic spreadsheets weighing down the air. For the first time in 36 years, Mother's Day doesn't feel like a spotlight pointed at an empty chair. I pour myself a warm cup of tea, look out the kitchen window at the quiet, snow-covered yard, and take a slow sip. The engine is finally running smooth, the road ahead is wide open, and for the first time since Thomas left, I am completely at home. Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.